Like many white-collar criminals, he then became an investment banker for Goldman Sachs. Conspiracy theorists are kind of obsessed with the Jewish population. White-collar criminals are kind of dumb. Even my group messages are encrypted, and all we talk about is what we had for lunch and whether Mercury's in retrograde. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's very fishy. So, of course, Steve Bannon was part of it. My name's Leija. I'm a real-life lawyer, and I'm on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. Today, in honor of Steve Bannon's arrest for wire fraud and money laundering, I want to talk to you about white-collar crime. What is wire fraud and money laundering? What's a Ponzi scheme? Let's find out. Before we start, I would like to offer the following disclaimer, and that is that I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer. Nothing that I say should be construed as legal advice, and you should always seek the advice of a licensed attorney when you have legal questions. If you find this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more from me. Let's get into it. Who's Steve Bannon? Let's start there. He was born in Virginia in 1953. He's a Sagittarius of all things. He went to Virginia Tech for his undergrad and then got a master's in national security studies from Georgetown, followed by an MBA from Harvard. He served in the Navy for 7 years, including a stint at the Pentagon, and he was deployed to Iran during the hostage crisis there in 1980. The failure of that mission in Iran, coupled with a number of things, including the September 11th terrorist attacks and the ensuing war, all combined to make Bannon more and more political as he started realizing that the establishment wasn't handling things properly, and his response to that was to go so far right he fell off the map. Like many white-collar criminals, he then became an investment banker for Goldman Sachs, eventually getting into mergers and acquisitions in the entertainment industry and opening his own boutique investment bank that specialized in media. At one point, he helped negotiate a sale to Turner Broadcasting System, and instead of taking a regular paycheck from it, he took a stake out in 5 different TV shows, including Seinfeld. So every time you watch a rerun of Seinfeld, Bannon gets paid. As part of his role financing media buyouts, he got involved in production of all things and became a film producer. He made 18 films, and that's how we met Andrew Breitbart. Bannon began producing more and more politicized far-right films, including a film on Ronald Reagan called In the Face of Evil, and a documentary film called Fire from the Heartland: The Awakening of the Conservative Woman, as well as Occupy Unmasked in 2012. There's evidence of a draft of a documentary that he had started called Destroying the Great Satan: The Rise of Islamic Fascism in America. And part of that draft included the quote, "Although driven by the best intentions, institutions such as the media, the Jewish community, and government agencies were appeasing jihadists aiming to create an Islamic republic." Which is so wild to me, because that is just some of the most typical conspiracy theorist rhetoric I've heard. Conspiracy theorists are kind of obsessed with the Jewish population. They're really anti-Semitic, and they are convinced that the Jews have this entire underground banking system that has taken over the world and that controls everything. And of course, mainstream media is, I guess, a branch of all of this. I'm not entirely clear on it. Obviously, I haven't gotten too deep into the conspiracy theorist websites. Bannon, Breitbart News, and I'm sure a lot of the films that Bannon helped produce all kind of feed into this conspiracy theory logic, which frankly is illogical, because conspiracy theorists are some of the most cynical people I've ever met in terms of humanity. They think that everyone's out to get you, that everyone's plotting, everyone's scheming, and everyone can be corrupted. But somehow they still think that humanity is capable of these large-scale, underground, global takeovers. I have a lot of faith in humanity and in humans for a lot of reasons, but I'm very cynical about our ability to pull off large-scale projects, especially a global underground takeover of our entire banking system. It's just, we're too dumb. We're too stupid to pull off something like that. Plain and simple. Now, Bannon's latest scheme is not his first foray into nonprofits. He founded a nonprofit in 2012 called the Government Accountability Institute. He also worked as a VP of Cambridge Analytica at one point. You'll recall that that is the data analytics firm that was involved in the Facebook data breach of millions of Americans' data that was eventually used to influence the 2016 election of Donald Trump, on whose campaign Steve Bannon was prominent, and in whose administration Steve Bannon was given a very prominent position. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that's not even conspiracy theory level coincidence. That's just bad government. And then, of course, Steve Bannon was one of the founding members of Breitbart News, which is a racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic news website that he then became the head of in 2012 and pushed it even further and further to the alt-right. He did step down from his role at Breitbart when he accepted his position on the Trump campaign and during his time in the White House, and then he returned after he was fired from the White House in 2017 and then stepped down again in 2018. And that was rumored to be because he was actually pushed out due to his worsening reputation and unpredictable behavior. He was appointed chief executive of Trump's campaign in 2016 and then chief strategist and senior counselor to Trump once he got into the White House in 2017. After that, he started a nonprofit called Citizens of the American Republic, which is a dark money organization, which I don't know a ton about and would love to do a whole separate video on, but it's basically a nonprofit, so they're tax exempt, but they don't have to report who their donors are and how much money they have and what they're giving their money to, but they do give a ton of money to political organizations, but they're not considered a PAC because technically their goals as an organization are not part of the electoral political process. It's very fishy. So of course Steve Bannon was part of it. So then in 2018, this GoFundMe was started by a veteran called We Build the Wall that raised a bunch of money from private individuals to send to the US government to build a wall along the southern border under the theory that if private citizens fund it, it'll get done faster. It ended up raising $17 million in the first 2 weeks. It was the largest GoFundMe in history. But then GoFundMe started asking questions about what organization or where the money was actually going to and if it was legit. And that's when Steve Bannon got on board. He helped form a nonprofit organization called We Build the Wall and make it look really legit so that GoFundMe would release the funds. They eventually did, and through other efforts on their website, etc., and by promising that 100% of the proceeds would go towards building a wall, they were able to raise a total of $25 million from donors. Again, throughout their fundraising campaign, on their websites, and their emails, they always promised that 100% of the proceeds would go towards building the wall. Well, it turns out that wasn't true, and that brings us to today, where Bannon is out on $5 million worth of bail after being arrested on August 20th for wire fraud and money laundering. He was reportedly arrested while aboard a 150-foot, $35 million yacht owned by exiled Chinese billionaire Guo Wenwei. According to the indictment, which was filed in the Southern District of New York, Bannon, along with 3 other co-conspirators, created a fake nonprofit and a shell company that they used to launder donor money in order to pay themselves quite a bit of money. It's alleged that Bannon siphoned off about $1 million. One of his other co-conspirators, the one who very blatantly claimed that he would never receive a salary, was at one point receiving $20,000 a month, and in total ended up siphoning off about $350,000 of donor money, allegedly. A lot of the indictment confirmed the scheme through text messages that were sent amongst the co-conspirators. One common theme that I've found throughout white-collar crimes is that white-collar criminals are kind of dumb. I think they get a little cocky and think that they can get away with anything, and so they do things like send unencrypted messages. Even my group messages are encrypted, and all we talk about is what we had for lunch and whether Mercury's in retrograde. Even more incriminating is that after their bank alerted them that they might be under criminal investigation, they switched to encrypted messaging and removed mentions on their sites that 100% of funds would be going towards the wall. So this indictment filed in the Southern District of New York, it was a 2-count indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. So let's talk now about white-collar crime. What is it? So you probably think of someone like the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort. That's a type of white-collar crime. It's basically the use of money or stocks to commit some sort of fraud, to get money that you're not supposed to have. It involves a lot of very tangled webs of lies that often, like I said, white-collar criminals are a little too dumb to keep separated, and they almost always inevitably collapse at some point. The typical white-collar criminal is often a middle-aged white man, someone like an investment banker or a stockbroker, someone for whom all it would take was a little click here and a few tweaks there to get hold of a lot of money he's not supposed to have. And I say he because it's almost always a man, but not always. Not always. There are a number of different types of white-collar crimes, but I wanted to talk to you about the 3 that are most prominent, at least in the news, and that's wire fraud, money laundering, and Ponzi schemes. Bannon's not accused of running a Ponzi scheme, and he didn't, but I did want to talk a little bit about what it is because I feel like it comes up a lot and it's not necessarily clear to everyone what a Ponzi scheme actually is. So let's start with money laundering. Money laundering is defined under 18 U.S.C. 1956, and it states, whoever, knowing that the property involved in a financial transaction represents the proceeds of some form of unlawful activity, conducts or attempts to conduct such a financial transaction which in fact involves the proceeds of specified unlawful activity, knowing that the transaction is designed in whole or in part to conceal or disguise the nature, the location, the source, the ownership, or the control of the proceeds of specified unlawful activity, shall be sentenced to a fine of not more than $500,000 or twice the value of the property involved in the transaction, whichever is greater, or imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. Now, that section of the United States Code is longer, but that's the section that Bannon has been indicted under. So basically, if there's money that you know was obtained unlawfully, and then you help in a transaction that is meant to conceal where that money came from, that's money laundering. A lot of times it's through a shell company. If you watched Breaking Bad, they laundered their money through that car wash. That's the basic idea. You're trying to evade the IRS from knowing where you got this money and becoming suspicious. And that's exactly what Steve Bannon allegedly did here, and if the indictment is believed to be true by the jury, if it ended up going to trial, then they likely have a strong case for money laundering because the company that they created wasn't real. The transactions that they used to funnel money from We Build the Wall into the company and then to pay out the Bannon and his co-conspirators, there's no legitimate transactions behind what the books say. According to the indictment, again, this is all alleged, there's a very good chance that they have a strong case here. There are a couple defenses to money laundering that I don't think Bannon would have at his disposal in this situation. One of the defenses is an absence of intent to commit the crime. So if you didn't know that what you were doing was money laundering, you didn't know that the money you had was illegally obtained, you could use that as a defense if you're accused of money laundering. Here, I think it would be hard for Bannon to claim that he didn't know, considering he was so involved with the creation of the shell company and the funneling of the funds, and he received $1 million of donor money. It would be really hard for him to show that he didn't know what he was doing. Another defense is duress, meaning that you believe that if you weren't to commit this crime of money laundering, then something terrible would happen to you or your family. You could see being used for someone who perhaps was involved with a drug cartel or the mafia or something, and they did a crime because they were afraid for their life. That's where that defense would come in, and obviously Bannon wouldn't have that at his disposal. And then there's always the defense that they don't have sufficient evidence, which in this case may be a possibility. It would depend on how the case unfolds and how they obtained the evidence that they did obtain. At this point, it looks pretty damning based on the indictment. There are text messages that pretty blatantly say that they were using the shell company to conceal who was getting paid and that they were lying to investors. So it seems like they probably have a pretty strong case against him. That's not to say that there won't be a plea deal of some sort. That is common, where the person who has been indicted will plead guilty and will get a lesser sentence, or will give the government information that it wants in exchange for a lesser sentence, things like that. So I'm not saying that he's going to go to jail for 20 years because that's what the statute says that he could go away for. I'm just saying that based on the indictment, it looks like they have a pretty strong case. Okay, and then we have wire fraud. A conviction of wire fraud or mail fraud is often accompanied another type of white-collar crime, because often in order to commit a white-collar crime like money laundering, for example, you also need to commit wire fraud or mail fraud. So let's look at the statute. The statute is 18 U.S.C. 1343, and it says, whoever having devised or intending to devise any scheme or artifice to defraud or for obtaining money or property by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, representations, or promises, transmits or causes to be transmitted by means of wire, radio, or television communication in interstate or foreign commerce, any writings, signs, signals, pictures, or sounds for the purpose of executing such scheme or artifice, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. So this is basically if you've used some form of communications in order to obtain money illegally from someone or to commit fraud of some sort. This includes certain uses of the internet, including email, because the very nature of email is that it crosses state lines almost always in order to go to a server first and then be sent to the recipient. So the elements are, you need to have a scheme to defraud via false pretenses, the intent to defraud, the actual making of materially false representations, and that has to be via the transmission of communications over internet, radio, television, wire of some sort. This can also be committed through the mail, and that would be called mail fraud. And mail fraud was a precursor to wire fraud, or more specifically, mail fraud came first and then Congress created another law to create wire fraud, which is basically the same thing as mail fraud. It's just using newer technologies. So like I said, wire fraud can be committed along with pretty much any other fraud-based offense. You got insurance fraud, bank fraud, securities fraud, tax fraud, and of course Ponzi schemes. So that brings us to what is a Ponzi scheme. Again, Bannon was not accused of running a Ponzi scheme. I just think it's interesting and probably something you might be wondering what it is. It falls into the category of white-collar crime, so let's dig in. So basically, what a Ponzi scheme is when you have investors, you promise them a return on their investment, and usually that promise of a return is a much higher percentage than they could find anywhere else in the market. They rely on that promise, give you their money, and then you actually don't invest it, or you do invest it, but it starts losing a bunch of money, and instead of telling them that you've lost them a bunch of money, you get more money from new investors, and you use that new investor money to pay off your old investors, so that they think that what they're getting is a return on their investment, but really what they're getting is stolen money from other investors who have again relied on your promise that you're going to get them a certain percentage of return. So that you could see how this would become a pretty dangerous cycle and a hole that you would just continually dig yourself in until investors start realizing that you don't actually have their money invested in sound investments and that they're not actually going to get their money back. People have been defrauded of their entire life savings through Ponzi schemes. There are Ponzi schemes that target, for example, elderly people who give away their entire life savings hoping that they'll get a return and then end up destitute. It's a really kind of gross crime because it's completely born of greed and stupidity, because you think that you're invincible and you can just run this scheme into the ground and no one will ever know. So Ponzi schemes were named after a guy named Charles Ponzi who ran a Ponzi scheme in the 1920s. It wasn't the first Ponzi scheme ever, but it was one of the most notorious because of the amount of media coverage that it got, which is why Ponzi schemes were named after Charles Ponzi. One of the earlier Ponzi schemes in the United States was run by a woman named Sarah Howe. Sarah was a fortune teller in Boston before opening the Ladies Deposit Company of Boston in 1879. This was a savings bank meant only for unmarried women. She claimed that the company was funded by a charity and that women who invested would get an 8% return. She ended up getting about $500,000 from around 1,200 women from all across the country. That's about $13.5 million in today's money. And the scheme eventually collapsed in 1880, and then she was sentenced to 3 years in prison for it. After she got out of prison, she did some more scheming and somehow managed to avoid prison, and then eventually went back to fortune telling before dying in 1892, RIP Sarah Howe. And the largest Ponzi scheme ever was the Madoff scandal in 2008. It said that he had around 13,000 accounts and was ordered to pay a restitution of $17 billion and was sentenced to 150 years in prison. This was after committing about 20 years worth of securities fraud. But that's a long time for a Ponzi scheme to last. Like I said, it's a hole that you dig yourself in and people eventually find out. He was able to make it last for decades because of his reputation. He was one of the founding members of the NASDAQ Stock Exchange and served for a term as its chair. He was well respected and a highly esteemed financial expert. And while running his Ponzi scheme, he was also running a legitimate business. The Ponzi scheme was one arm of his larger business structure. He also went undetected for so long because his promises to investors were pretty moderate, though however they were suspiciously consistent. And even though the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the one that does investigations around securities fraud, was suspicious, they were unable to find kind of a smoking gun, something that they could use to actually prosecute Madoff for decades, which is why it took so long and why the Ponzi scheme was allowed to continue for so long, because they need something to be able to definitively prove that he did it before bringing charges. So Madoff was one of the smarter white-collar criminals. Okay, so that's a Ponzi scheme. Again, Bannon's not accused of a Ponzi scheme, he's accused of wire fraud. There are some available defenses for wire fraud, much like money laundering. I don't know that any of these would be helpful for Bannon's case. Again, there needs to be intent to commit the fraud, so if the person doesn't know that what they're doing is fraud, or they thought in good faith that what they were doing was legal, then that can be a solid defense when accused of wire fraud. In this case, again, the evidence alleges that Bannon very much knew what he was doing. And another defense that he might use, but again probably would be unsuccessful, is the idea of puffery or puffing. Basically, there is a certain type of talk or business jargon or sales language that can be used that won't be considered fraudulent when used in connection with sales. If it's something that in the normal course of business the average person wouldn't hear someone give that sales pitch and think that they were actually promising a certain outcome. So saying, this is the best you'll ever try, or this is amazing. It's a lot of opinions. It's puffing up what you're trying to sell in order to entice people to buy. That can be used as a defense because mere puffery is not considered a type of fraud. Basically, we're assuming that consumers are smart enough to know that salespeople are going to kind of puff up what they're trying to sell to you. However, promising people and inducing them, according to the indictment, inducing people to give you their money under the pretenses that you're going to use 100% of that money towards building a wall would probably not fall under mere puffery. If they made the promise, we're going to build the best wall ever, and it ended up being kind of a shitty wall, that might be puffery that they wouldn't be able to be prosecuted under. But promising that 100% of the proceeds and getting people to give you their money because you say 100% of the proceeds are going to this wall building and then taking millions of that money for personal expenses, probably not going to fall under the puffery defense. Okay, so that has been a very brief overview of white-collar crime, specifically money laundering and wire fraud, which Bannon has been indicted under in the Southern District of New York. Bannon is out on $5 million bail after pleading not guilty, and he has an initial pretrial hearing at the end of August. Beyond that, trial dates are usually set out about a year beyond the pretrial hearing so that the parties have time for discovery so that they can gather all of their evidence. However, prosecutors could offer Bannon a plea deal before a trial ever happens. Like I was talking about earlier, he could accept a lighter sentence by pleading guilty or give the government more information that they're looking for in order to receive a lighter sentence. So that all depends, and it's hard to know what's next for Steve Bannon or what kind of punishment he might get for this alleged white-collar crime that he's committed. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any topics or questions for future videos, please comment down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you found it interesting or entertaining, and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to hear more from me. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye! Bubbles! Bannon, along with his three Bubbles!